All right. As we have a lot of great information to share this morning, we are going to go ahead and get started. So I want to welcome you again. Thank you so much for being here this morning with us to talk about developing effective school policies around AI. If we have not met, I'm Nina Davis. I am the Associate Director for Member Services and Middle Level at MASSP. A few things before we begin. We want to invite you to use the Q&A system to pose questions and also upvote questions that you want to make sure are asked. We ask you to use the chat to add ideas and or comments. A copy of the slide deck and a link to our recording of today's sessions will be emailed to participants and also distributed in our future publications. So here is our disclaimer. We are recording and posting this for public viewing just so that you're aware. The information provided by MASSP and panelists are advisory in nature based on information as of today's date and are intended to guide thinking. We advise you to seek specific guidance in any of these areas from your district leadership, legal counsel, and local law enforcement. If you are seeking a thought partner to help with brainstorming and or planning, please contact any member of the MASSP team. We strongly recommend that decision makers work in collaboration with your district leadership, teachers, student leaders, and your Board of Education based on the most current information available in local capacity. So there's our disclaimer, and we're going to go ahead and get started. We have the pleasure of having Adam Blaylock from Miller Johnson Attorneys here with us today. Kevin is going to sit this one out. I'm sure you're familiar with Kevin, and we will see him again in future legal webinars. But with that, I am going to go ahead and hand the mic over to Adam so that he can get started. I'm going to stop sharing. And Adam, the floor is all yours.
All right, so I'll introduce myself as I do my best to try and share my screen as appropriate. So my name is Adam Blaylock. I have been a practicing attorney since 2023 now. I've worked in and around schools for almost my entire career. I did spend 4.5 wonderful years at Lincoln Consolidated Schools in Ypsilanti, Michigan as the Director of Human Resources there. I was the chief COVID person and all of the other fun things that came along with being a district administrator between 2019 and 2023. I've been with the MJ team now for a little bit longer than a year, and I inauspiciously raised my hand to be our AI expert right when I joined, and that's part of why I'm here now, is that it's an area of interest for me, but in part because I think it's incredibly important for educators. But more importantly, it's an area where a lot of folks in the education realm are seeking guidance. So the hope is that I'll be able to help a little bit with that today, although I do not claim to have all of the answers because it is such a new and developing area for us. All right, so I am going to try and share, and I will ask if it is... I'll try and change the display settings there. Okay. Are we good now? Excellent. All right. So today's topic is developing effective AI policies in schools. And I want to put on the agenda today what we're going to not do and what we will hopefully do throughout the course of today's presentation. So this is not intended to be the 101 course in AI. I know especially Tom Leitz and the MASSP have done a lot of front loading on that work. So I'm not going to spend much time talking about what AI does, its strengths and weaknesses, what are hallucinations, but I do want to spend time with some of those kind of next steps. We'll talk a little bit about ongoing legislation, some of the difficult issues. We'll talk a little bit about how to deal with this mess, because just like any new technology or new area, school administrators that are on the front lines get to say, all right, I'm the one that gets to deal with this. And then ultimately, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about what we should be thinking about when developing policy. And I want to caution everyone, here's the reality. It's very early in this process. So things that may seem like good ideas on October 3rd, may not be on November 3rd. So I want you to be mindful of that as we go through the process today. And as always, please, please, please feel free to ask questions. I know this is a panel type presentation today, but drop them in the chat and I will do my absolute best to review those and go over them. And I will ask Nina to prompt me when I go past one that I shouldn't have, all right? All right. So I do want to spend just a slide or two talking about some of the kind of developments that we've seen in AI. So ChatGPT first really came onto the scene in the spring of 2023. That's when it really reached prominence. And in the new iterations that we've seen, we're already seeing big changes. We're talking about a system that can perform at an extremely high level on the SAT exam. And this isn't even the most current system that we have in place. ChatGPT 4, which is about 1.5 iterations old now, is performing better than 96% of students on the SAT. And this has a personal impact on me, and I like to bring this one up because it's about the bar exam, so it's specifically for lawyers. ChatGPT 4 is outperforming lawyers on the bar exam. And again, I want to emphasize, this is why I think it's important. It's important because it's a tool that we're going to be able to use just like we use calculators and computers in order to be more efficient, more productive, and ultimately have a bigger impact on everything that's going on in the world. So while it will be disruptive, and I think our instructional leaders are really focused on some of the ways to try and match AI to our student needs and student growth over the future, it's also important to understand all of the different nuances that are going to come along with these AI tools in the short term and in the long term. So one of the big issues that you will deal with or should be thinking about upfront is data issues. I know, because I've had enough conversations with Tom over the last 1.5 years, that this is something that's on everyone's mind. It's what do we do with these tools as it relates to all of our student data pieces? So there are 3 primary legislative things that are already in place that we should be considering and thinking about every time we talk about AI, particularly when you talk about our students and our staff. The first one is FERPA, and I will ask the question and expect no response. Is anyone unfamiliar with FERPA in this room? I wouldn't expect so. So the big question is, do we have parental consent for a data disclosure? That's the big question, because ultimately the vast majority of FERPA exceptions that are going to apply are not going to. And so I want you, anytime you're dealing with an AI issue as a school administrator, be thinking about where is the student data going and is it properly controlled by the district? And that's something that you should absolutely be involving your district leadership in, whether it's your superintendent or director of technology, your director of curriculum and instruction, whoever it may be, whoever owns those pieces. But when you have a contract for a new tool, because that's something that you might be pushing for, some new opportunity for students to use some new tool, I want you to think about what's going on with that data, because that's one of the underlying risks that I think is under the surface of these really cool tools. Next, SIPA, it's another law that governs a lot of the obligations that we have as schools. The biggest obligation is it relates to filtering obligations, but there is an obligation under SIPA to educate regarding online behaviors. So as a building leader, as someone that's going to be dealing with students, we started talking about social media. We've started talking about these other online behaviors. I am of the opinion that we are now at the point where we should be talking about AI behaviors with our students as well. So that's an obligation that we as educators have, is to make sure that we educate regarding those online behaviors under SIPA. And that's something else that I would encourage you to start rolling into your online behavior conversations that you have with your students. And then finally, there's another big law that's out there. It's called COPPA. So generally, the law requires that students under the age of 13 not have access to large swaths of the internet absent parental consent. And schools can substitute and stand in for a parent in those circumstances. But the question is, do we want to? So for those of us at the high school level, this is not going to be as big of an issue. But those at the middle level, one of the things that you will need to keep in mind as you talk about AI tools is, do we have parental consent? And if we don't, do we want to provide our consent as an organization on behalf of our students that are under the age of 13? So there's a 5-step test. You're supposed to consider about 20 different things as you go through that process. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time going through it today, but I want all of you that are working at the middle level to be thinking about that as well. That's an issue to keep in mind whenever you talk about AI tool access for our middle level students or lower, if we've got any elementary folks or elementary focused folks as well. There has been discussion about a COPPA 2.0. It passed the US Senate, but it has not had any movement in the US House. So it's not law yet, but there's still a couple months left before we've got a new Congress. So we could see some movement between now and the end of the year. If and when that happens, the general structure of that bill is that it would prohibit social media companies from gathering information from children up to age 17 and impose some other obligations. So it could be something that would potentially expand our obligations and expand our thought to the high school level. But again, I don't think that's something we need to be too worried about in the short term. And if and when we get to that point, we'll have more updates once the legislative text is finalized. Okay. So here's the practical reality. With any new tool, there come questions and worries. So the things that I'm hearing about, and this is a great opportunity for any of our participants to say, hey, there's another issue that you haven't talked about or haven't put on the screen yet. There are really 4 areas that I am hearing concerns in. One is related to academic dishonesty or cheating, academic integrity issues. What do we do with a student that uses this tool in a way that we haven't predicted or haven't considered that doesn't feel right according to our academic integrity policies? Second is employee integrity. Are employees doing the things that they need to do in order to make sure that instruction is happening at a high level in our classrooms? Third is videos, and I use that term broadly to really talk about deepfakes. And so we'll talk a little bit about those for everyone in the audience. And then fourth is the issue that we've talked about a lot already, which is data protection and data control. That's been an issue and part of the conversation at the outset. So we won't spend a whole lot more time talking about those data protection or data control issues. But again, those are the big worries that I'm seeing on a regular basis from my seat as counsel to school districts across the state. All right, so I do want to spend a little bit of time giving the legislative update. So since AI has kind of become this prominent thing, there have been a number of laws that have passed in various states across the country. And I really put those things in 5 different buckets. There are laws that govern the use of AI as it relates to elections. There are laws that govern the use of AI related to deepfakes. There are laws that govern AI as it relates to what I would call abusive material, so inappropriate or obscene material. There are laws that cover consumer protection issues, which are designed in order to help keep consumers from being misled by these AI tools. And then there's the creation of these steering committees that say, hey, we're going to make a plan to go do something. So as it relates to the election law issue, and I will be honest, it's unlikely, but you could see it at a board level, right? You could see that for school board elections coming up this year. Most of our public schools are going to have elections in the next couple of weeks here. There are a number of states that have passed laws that prohibit the use of unfettered AI in the election season. The limits on those have been kind of murky. The way that the different legislative priorities are dealing with it is either requiring a disclaimer, outright prohibiting it. So there's a lot of variation there. What I think is important, though, and something to be keeping in mind, is that there are First Amendment challenges that are going on. And so in California, they recently passed a law prohibiting the use of AI in the election season, and it was enjoined in a court yesterday. So when these kinds of policies are being passed on a broad swath, what I think that means for us as policymakers is this. We've got to be a little mindful about the First Amendment issues that are coming up. We've got to be a little bit mindful as we talk through policy about how we're going to deal with any of those First Amendment issues that might come up from a student relations stance. So ultimately, and I know with the election coming that most of our secondary folks are probably dealing with some kind of First Amendment issues. I know I've helped a couple of clients with those issues in the last week or two. That's something to keep in mind when we're talking about AI policy as well. For our next bucket, we've got deepfakes, and there's, by my estimation, and I admittedly have not gone through every law that's passed in the country over the last year and a half. There's only one law that specifically deals with deepfakes. And I need to pause for a second because I have to give one or two stories that I think are important here, especially for school leaders. Is that there was a New York Times article a couple months back about a deepfake case in Baltimore. And so what had happened is that a group of students had gotten together and created a AI generated audio recording of their principal saying some extraordinarily inappropriate and racist things. Now, ultimately, after investigation, it was shown to be not accurate. It was shown to be a fake. But those are the kinds of things that when we talk about deep fakes give me, as a school attorney, a lot of anxiety. It's the opportunity for someone to create something that looks very real that isn't true and is going to paint them in a false light. So New Hampshire has prohibited this use of certain deepfakes and creates a private claim of action. So that means this person that's impacted by that deepfake can go out and sue. But that doesn't change some of the underlying issues that we'll see. And that's also the only law that I've seen directly related to deepfakes at this point. So while that's an area where we may see more legislation in the future, it's an area that's not well legislated at this point. All right, the next area, consumer protection. There are a couple of states that have created this some kind of requirement related to making sure that consumers have all the information available to them. So applying that same deepfake concept and then putting the resources of a private entity behind it means that you could get even more realistic. And so the concerns that those legislatures are trying to address is making sure that consumers have those opportunities and make sure that they have all the accurate information in front of them as well. Then we have the group that deals with abusive material. And I quite frankly didn't want to put the text on the screen about the kinds of things that are prohibited by these because the reality is that they are all gross. They are all things that as school administrators and as school attorneys, we do not want to deal with, but they do unfortunately come up from time to time. So as you can see, there are 5 states that have expressly prohibited the creation of abusive material pursuant to AI. And what I would say and encourage is that the same kinds of things that can create criminal liability if you possess them, when we talk about inappropriate images of minors, things along those lines, can still be deemed and seen as unlawful even outside of these states. So the FBI has taken the position that the possession of AI-generated abusive material is still unlawful. That was part of it. There was a New York Times article again about that topic in New York a couple months back. So again, this is an area where we're seeing more and more legislation. And I'll keep in mind, all of this stuff has happened over the past 18 months or so, all of these different laws. So it's unusual to see that much activity in one area in such a short period of time. All right, finally, we've got the 5th bucket, which I would say is the most useless of the 5 buckets. It's the plan to make a plan. So many states have enacted some kind of committee or appropriated money to explore, consider, develop AI capabilities. Practically speaking, it's a plan to make a plan. It's an initiative in which they are considering doing something. And I'm going to put on the next screen exactly what Michigan has done. And this is word for word, straight from the State School Aid Act. This is exactly what Michigan has done, is they've created a steering committee, in my opinion. So they've allocated 500 grand to create a comprehensive statewide laboratory designed to function as a hub for cutting edge research, the identification and dissemination of best practices, rigorous experimentation, policy formulation, and proactive efforts to enhance awareness about the responsible utilization of artificial intelligence in schools. That is a whole lot of words to say we're going to make a plan. So the reality is that we are in Michigan a little bit in the wild, wild west. there is not a lot of clear legislative guidance for what school administrators and schools should be doing to manage these concepts. And that's hard. It's just hard. So I think that the group here is doing what they should be doing, which is educating yourselves, because these issues are going to come up. I remember I was sharing this story in advance of our session today. Like I am of the age where social media was at its advent when I was in high school. So the big thing for me when I was like a sophomore, junior, senior in high school was that when you got a Facebook, that meant you got a college email. That right there is like a big thing, right? And I think we're going to see the same thing in these AI areas. We're going to see kids that are trying to use these tools and finding ways to be more efficient or be cool or whatever it may be. And ultimately, we've got to be prepared for how to deal with those things. And that's really what we're going to start turning to with the rest of our time today. We're going to talk about policy. We're going to talk about code of conduct concepts, right? So the first question is, what tools do we have? Well, as I just described in the law, we don't have a lot yet. Beyond that, there are really, in my mind, kind of three layers to the conversation, right? There's what's the board policy? What does that say? What are the administrative regulations implementing that board policy say? So that's the top level. That's the district level stuff. Below that, we've got the student code of conduct. So that's the stuff that the group in this room are going to be closest to, the things that you're most familiar with. And then we also have this kind of side issue of the acceptable use policy. So whoever's in charge of your technology pieces probably has an acceptable use policy that all of your students and staff sign. I'm also willing to bet it hasn't been updated since 2004. So I would encourage you to take a look at that, pull that out with your director of technology and say, hey, is there something we should be including here? Because I think it's finally time to really have that conversation. Once we get within the code of conduct, I think there are really four major concepts that we see the use of AI really impacting, right? We've got harassment and bullying. That's fairly common. We've got impersonation. We've got the faking of someone. We've got the academic integrity pieces. And then we've got false reporting, which I think is another major concept that we often see as potentially a way to enforce and regulate some of the student behaviors that we'll see. So I'm realizing I put these a little out of the order that I probably should have, but we'll jump straight into academic integrity first. So I wanted to provide a couple of examples for what districts across the country are doing. I will give you an example of what MJ's standard policy is towards the end of this section, but I don't want to be overly biased and say that we're right, so I'll use some other examples first. So, and I'll give everyone just a second to read this particular example. So it says, in certain situations, AI may be used as a learning tool or a study aid. Students who wish to use AI for legitimate educational purposes must have permission from a teacher or an administrator. Students may use AI as authorized in their individualized education program. Students may not use AI, including AI image or voice generator technology, to imitate others, or violate school rules or school district policies. So in this example, I think there's two concepts that are really prominently in the language. The one is, when do students have authority to use these tools? They need permission from the teacher. And then the other is a prohibition against certain kinds of use of these tools. Two concepts, right? So when do they have authority? When do they have permission? When can a student use these tools? And then what kinds of activities are prohibited? And I think that fundamentally is the structure with which you should be thinking about code of conduct, AI policy, student behavior, right? When do they have the right and the authority to use these tools? And when is the use prohibited, even if they do have authority to use it? All right, so we'll give another example here focused on academic integrity. AI is not a substitute for schoolwork that requires original thought. Students may not claim AI-generated content as their own work. The use of AI to take tests, complete assignments, create multimedia projects, write papers, or complete schoolwork without permission of a teacher or administrator is strictly prohibited. The use of AI for these purposes constitutes cheating or plagiarism. So again, those same two concepts that we just discussed are coming back into play, right? First and foremost, we've got when do they have authority? You need the permission of a teacher or administrator. And then we've got a prohibition against those uses in those particular manners, right? Now, I don't think it's quite as explicit as the last line in the last slide in terms of some of those prohibitions on those other issues that we're talking about. This is really focused on the academic integrity pieces, but it gives a little bit of a structure for what this might look like. So one of the things that has become a kind of a common refrain for me is rely on your existing policies. Here is the reality. Every single administrator in this chat has some kind of code of conduct that already exists. I know because it's required to that it prohibits bullying. I know that it prohibits plagiarism or academic dishonesty. I know that it prohibits harassment or discrimination because all of those things are baseline expectations in every single code of conduct that I've ever reviewed. If your code of conduct doesn't have any of those things in there, call me afterwards because we need to have a different kind of conversation. So I want to be clear about this. I don't believe AI policy has to reinvent the wheel. It's got to fill in the gaps. Use those existing policies and regulations and use them as the tools that you need to govern those underlying prohibited behaviors. And I'm also going to say that it's incredibly important to be flexible. I was sharing with Nina in advance. I was like, we started putting out our first AI policy about a year ago now. I sent it out, and then 3 weeks later, I was like, feels a little out of date already. And that's just the reality of how quickly this is developing. And I know it feels like it has slowed down a little bit, but I think that some of the things that we're going to see related to the use and generation of deep fake images, and the ability to interact with AI verbally via sound rather than via typed prompts is really going to change things. And that's before the new iPhones that are directly hooked into ChatGPT are really widely available. So keep that in mind too, is like the new iPhones, the new iOS is like directly hooked into ChatGPT. So I think it's incredibly important to realize that these are going to become more prolific in very short order, in my view. So what I think is one of those big issues that has underlied a lot of our conversation so far today is how do we deal with deepfakes? And they are, I am the parent of very young children. I've got a 4-year-old and an almost 3-year-old daughter. The idea of fake images being created by some nefarious third party horrifies me. I think that it is one of the areas that gives everyone anxiety. And I'm also mindful of the fact that, I mean, I've done a lot of investigations in my time. I didn't do it or that's fake is not exactly an uncommon refrain. And I'm sure that a 16-year-old student's going to use that a little bit more frequently than adults do. And I typically deal with adult investigations. But the reality is that it's going to be easier to fake stuff than it has been historically. So I encourage everyone that sits through one of my presentations on this to be just have a little bit of healthy skepticism. If someone says it's fake, we probably need to spend a few minutes to at least examine whether or not that's a credible allegation. If you've got two students that are duking it out over who created some video or whatever it may be that's harassing or bullying another student, we probably have to spend a little bit of time to say, okay, is this real? Is it fake? What is it? But importantly, and this is thematically true with what I've just been saying, is we've got to apply the student code of conduct. If we've got students that are making threats, bullying, engaging in harassing behaviors, engaging in behaviors that are prohibited by Title IX. And don't get me started about Title IX, because the reality is that as school administrators, you're going to be dealing with more of it than you have been historically. So I want you to be really mindful of that stuff. And I want you to be thinking about how exactly we're going to be skeptical when some new piece of information comes to us. And part of the process of being skeptical is also being familiar with the ways that those things get developed, right? So educating yourself in this way is important, but one of the things that I would encourage you to do is to spend a few minutes to try and research or figure out how do you identify a deepfake video? And I'll give you a little hint. It's usually in the hands. You will find that deepfake videos, they've got 8 fingers or 3 fingers, or hands are in weird places, or whatever it may be. Those kinds of details are where AI generated images typically do worse. And so you may be able to very easily identify whether or not something is faked just by looking at the hands. Okay. So, couple of ideas. So those of you that are Miller-Johnson policy clients, this is something that it very closely resembles what our current policy and administrative regulations read. We have an ethos. We tend to believe in our school administrators. We believe in giving them as much discretion as possible. And we believe in making sure that we are flexible to deal with these things. So our policy statements tend to be very broad. And then we say, okay, the meat and potatoes of it is really in the administrative regulations. So our policy statement is very simple. The superintendent will develop administrative regulations governing the use of large language models, which shall consider data privacy, training, acceptable use, and student use of such models or resources. Very simple. And then underlying that are the administrative regulation pieces, right? So, and you'll notice some themes to this that are consistent with some of our discussion. We're going to comply with industry standard data protection standards, right? We're going to provide appropriate training. We're going to maintain a list of approved generative AI tools. The student use of AI will be subject to the Student Code of Conduct. The use of those tools will be subject to the academic integrity policy. And some of these pieces are options, right? We'll provide notice to parents about the use of generative AI, because I recognize that different communities are going to have different expectations about those kinds of things. And then a couple of more concepts that we've gotten here. Sorry, I lost my train. I duplicated the slides there. And then the application and use of all of those tools pursuant to the district's acceptable use program policy or acceptable use agreement is also, I think, important. So let's talk a little bit about our staff, because I do think that staff training is appropriate and important in these concepts, because I am willing to bet that you've got a staff that is as diverse in age and experience with AI tools as students. And there are going to be folks in your buildings that have varying levels of interest in these tools and how to manage them. And in my opinion, and this is purely my opinion, the issues that I am seeing related to staff trying to enforce AI policy is founded more on misunderstanding than understanding of how the tools work. So one of the things that I think is incredibly important as a building leader is to take advantage of that and provide the information to your team so that they know how these tools work, and we can deal with them and we can make sure that our team is on the same page as it relates to the student stuff that's going to come in. So in my opinion, there's really two kind of pieces, right? They need appropriate training to know what to include in their syllabi and or instructions for assignments. Because one of the things that I am confident that you as school administrators are going to hear if you try and enforce that code of conduct is, they didn't tell me I couldn't use it. They said I couldn't use this tool. I just used it to help a little bit. So those are the kinds of hypotheticals that you're going to hear from students, because that's what a 15-year-old does, right? They deflect the blame and find some little nuance that we haven't considered. So making sure that the staff know what the expectations are and how to manage those things is, I think, the right thing to do. And then I also feel like they need some training to be able to identify signs of AI use. So sometimes that's really easy, because when ChatGPT first came out, what students were giving back in essays was, well, as an AI model, I can. That's really easy to identify the academic integrity issue. It's a lot more difficult when we talk about the question, and it's also an instructional leader question. Are we allowed, or should we be using AI tools to help students develop the outline for an essay? Is that plagiarism? Is it cheating? And depending on the way that that tool is structured and how it's used, it may be or it may not be under the traditional definition of plagiarism, in my opinion. So that's an area where I think having that conversation with your administrative team, your district leaders, your staff, particularly in your ELA departments, is going to be a really important piece. Because here's the reality, right? The reason that students will use these tools, particularly in the ELA area, is it's a heck of a lot faster and a heck of a lot easier than writing an essay. But our goal as educators is to make sure that our students have the right tools to succeed long term. And that's why I, to this day, still know all of my multiplication tables, because in third grade, they were drilled into my head, even though we had calculators back then, right? And that may not be best practice anymore, but it was best practice at the time. So spend the time to get your staff familiar, because I do believe that you will have fewer issues dealing with student use of these tools if the staff understand how they work and what the structure looks like. All right, so we've been going for about 40 minutes now, and we're going to get into some of the meat and potatoes. We're going to talk about some hypotheticals. So I will ask, as we go through this, we're gonna put them on the screen, and I'm gonna ask for a little audience participation for some thoughts on these hypotheticals. So while I'm not expecting everyone to respond, I hope I get a couple of responses. I know that there are always distractions when we're in the middle of these things, and I thankfully don't have to be in buildings dealing with students anymore. So I am appreciative of that. All right. So, first hypothetical, deepfake bullying. And you'll recognize some of these names if you know the MJ education group, because I can't use other names. I've got to use our names now. So, Kevin, Baum, and Adam, all students, use an AI tool to create a deepfake video of Jessica, making it appear as though she is engaging in inappropriate behavior and using offensive language towards other students. The video, which appears highly realistic, is shared on social media, leading to widespread bullying and harassment of Jessica. She experiences significant emotional distress, and her academic performance suffers. The boys claim it was just a joke and argue that they didn't create the content themselves. AI did. They also argue that because the video was created off campus, the school has no right to discipline them. So I think the first question that I'd ask our audience here is this: do you have the tools in your student code of conduct to deal with off-campus behaviors? Do you have the tools to deal with bullying? All right. So I am going to put a couple of guiding questions on the screen here. And I think that off-campus question is a really important one. I know, because schools do it quite frequently, we do deal with off-campus behavior sometimes. Under the new Title IX regulations, we're going to have to in a way that we haven't had to for a number of years. Should the students be held responsible for the deepfake and the subsequent bullying? And that right there, I think, may be one of the important distinctions to make in this particular hypothetical as well. the creation of the deep fake may not have been the bullying, but it may have caused the bullying. So the question that I have for the team, or the thought that I want to put in your head for this edge case, because all these hypotheticals are designed to be edge cases, right? They're designed to be difficult, that don't have good or easy answers. How do we manage that distinction where the cause is something like a deep fake, but the actual behavior is being done by someone else?
So to our participants, this is a reality that you may experience. Adam, I'm sure you can, let us know that you've seen things like this happening in our schools already. So, what I guess looking at that first question, um, how are you dealing with situations that may not have occurred in school? And how is your district, your building prepared to address those type of situations?
So in my view, I would look at how we have managed social media incidents in recent history, because I'm willing to bet that you've had some social media bullying at some point in the past few years. And I think that that kind of off-campus conduct is very similar to what we're talking about in this case. I do think that, that interesting question of should the deepfake creator be held responsible for bullying that others do is also a really difficult issue, right? Okay. We'll move on to another hypothetical, we'll move on to another edge case, but I want to make sure that everyone has some thoughts in their brains about some of these difficult issues that are going to come up. Because ultimately, when we talk about policy and procedure, we gotta think about how we're gonna fill in the gaps here.
We have one response here, Adam. I was waiting for everyone to warm up.
There we go. The response is: one approach when students or parents claim that the school has no authority over incidents that occurred outside of the school is to advise the victims to go to the police instead. When I've suggested that in the past, the parents and students then say they'd rather the school handle it. I think that is not an atypical response. So I tend to have a fairly robust view of the school's authority to take action. And so the reality is that sometimes off-campus conduct disrupts the educational environment. And so to the extent that off-campus conduct is disrupting the educational environment, it's harassing behaviors, it's Title IX related behaviors now, I am of the opinion that generally the school has the authority to take remedial action, whatever that may be. And how significant or severe that may be depends on what the underlying activity is. So the reality, in my view, is that schools have the authority to do things that happen outside the four walls of their campus, even though parents and students don't like that. But only to the extent that it impacts what's going on in school. So if a kiddo goes off in public, that's a different issue than if it's impacting the student body.
And Adam, would you go further just to reiterate on something that you brought up? Not only does the school have the authority, but now with some of the Title IX implications, they have the expectation to address it.
Absolutely. So with the new Title IX regulations, the language that we saw that limited our ability or authority to investigate and issue consequences for Title IX related activity off campus, that has changed. There is absolutely, with the new regulations, the expectation that we're going to deal with some of that. If you get into a situation like that, my first and only immediate guidance is contact your Title IX coordinator immediately, because it will be a mess. And I'm not excited for some of the new regulations for some of our school leaders, but it is what it is. We've got to deal with the legal structures that we have around this. All right, second hypothetical here. Eric uses an AI tool to create a highly realistic deepfake video of Kathy in sexually explicit situations, which he then shares with other students. The video spreads quickly, and Kathy becomes the target of sexual harassment both online and at school. She reports the incident, which falls under Title IX, as the deepfake creates a hostile environment for her. Eric claims the video was a joke and that he didn't mean to harass her, but Kathy feels unsafe and humiliated. Eric argues that since AI created the content, he isn't fully responsible for its impact. So I'll create a parallel to some of the things that I know we've seen in recent years is the existence of inappropriate photographs of students that will then circulate. That is the kind of the classic parallel to this in my view, even if this is a fake image that's created by AI. And in my view, it would be subject to the same kinds of consequences based on what's been created. So I recognize and always understand, well, I didn't mean to is a very standard defense from a teenager. But that doesn't mean that there aren't consequences for our actions. And as I shared earlier today, there's potentially criminal consequences for those things as well, just like there are for the possession of inappropriate images of a minor. So again, a couple of guiding questions of how should we handle cases. Something like this, I'm going to say you need to refer it to the Title IX policy. And I would absolutely loop your Title IX coordinator immediately and make sure that you're providing appropriate supportive measures to your impacted students. And then ultimately, should Eric face the same consequences as if he had created the content manually? My answer is going to be probably yes, unless there's some really weird mitigating circumstances. Okay. Next, we're going to shift a little bit away from deepfakes. We're going to talk about chatbot threats. So Adam uses an AI chatbot to generate threatening messages aimed at Kevin. The messages include explicit threats of violence, such as "you'll regret coming to school tomorrow and I'm going to hurt you." Kevin shows the messages to the school counselor and the administration launches an investigation. When confronted, Adam admits to using the AI to send the threats, but claims that since he didn't write the messages himself, he didn't intend to harm Kevin. He argues that the AI exaggerated the situation and that the threats shouldn't be taken seriously. So, and I'll just give a quick thing is like, you can absolutely generate something that'll get on social media and act like a human being responding to tweet threat. Like, I've seen it. It's crazy. So it is entirely possible in this case that Adam has not actually typed those words into the model and into the chatbot. So again, kind of guiding questions, right? Should Adam be held responsible for those threats that he initiated but didn't write? Transparently, I think this is a hard case. I think it's going to depend very much on what the guidance given to the bot was. It's going to depend very much on what was actually said and what the disruption to the school environment was. And so, again, I'll come back to, I generally take a strong view of a school's authority to keep kids safe. and quite frankly, my guidance, if you ever have a situation where you think a threat is, you do what you need to do to keep everyone safe first and worry about all the consequences for it later. But I'm not certain that we'd be able to issue discipline that would get upheld if challenged in this circumstance.
Well,
At
Adam,
least not based on the current legal structures.
that was my question because I'm not as familiar with the coding aspect or the building of the chatbot. So how much would an administrator be able to distinguish what was in this situation, Adam's part and how much he put in without him providing that information?
It may be very difficult. You may not be able to. And so I do believe that there's an element of good faith in all of this process, right? where as an administrator, you are charged with making millions of very difficult decisions on very short timelines. I would caution and encourage you to try and spend a few more minutes on this one than you might others. But I do very much think it's going to depend on the facts and circumstances. It's going to depend on what is being provided, what the actual threats are. And obviously there's a wide spectrum of threats between I'll meet you at the flagpole at 3 o'clock and some of the things that we've seen in the aftermath of Oxford. Like there's a very wide spectrum there. And the level of that threat, I think, is also going to dictate both some of the response as well as the potential consequence. If the chatbot is saying, I'm going to meet you at the flagpole at 3 o'clock, I'm probably going to be a little bit more lenient than if we see something that's a material, incredible threat to the school. And truthfully, what we've seen in terms of prosecutors as well as law enforcement, they take those latter kinds of threats extremely seriously. And the school districts that I've worked with also do so. And so they tend to take very severe consequences, even for that student that didn't intend, right? It got a little out of hand is not a great defense in those cases. Okay. Academic integrity, another hypothetical here. Jessica submits a highly technical research paper on renewable energy for her AP Environmental Science class. Her teacher, Mr. Daniels, notices that the paper is unusually well written compared to her previous work. After conducting a review, he suspects that Jessica used an AI tool to generate most of the content. When questioned, Jessica admits to using AI to organize her research and draft the paper, but argues she provided the ideas and selected the final version, so it shouldn't be considered cheating. However, the school's academic honesty policy does not yet address AI use because, of course, we've left that fact out, right? This is where I think that policy writing and that training, both for your students and staff, is incredibly important, is trying to create clear lines for what falls within that academic integrity policy. Because in the absence of more information, I think I would struggle with saying that she plagiarized. And I'm also willing to bet that most of the people in this particular panel might disagree with me. And I think that there's room for real debate on whether or not this would fall within the purview of plagiarism or not. So the reason that I would struggle with it is because organization, to me, is something that you can get feedback from. If you're the one that's generating the ideas and the AI tool is mostly proofreading, that to me doesn't feel like plagiarism. On the other hand, if we have a clear statement in our syllabus or academic integrity policy prohibiting the use of AI for writing papers, then I think that that would push me into that plagiarism world. But again, difficult issue, and intentionally so. These facts are intentionally written to be difficult because this is an area where I think that depending on what the teacher and the school has done, it could push it into either one of those buckets. Okay. Again, some of our getting questions, we'll move forward. I know we're starting to run a little low on time, so I want to make sure we get through. I've got 6 total, so we should be able to get to them all. Chatbot bullying, we're back to our chatbots. We've got Eric and Adam start using an AI program to generate personalized insults and memes targeting Bob, a classmate. The AI tool analyzes Bob's social media profiles, hobbies, and appearance to craft hurtful messages. These AI-generated insults are posted anonymously online and shared among students. Bob becomes the target of increased bullying, leading him to skip school and fall behind academically. When the cyberbullying is traced back to Eric and Adam, they argue that they didn't write the insults themselves, the AI did, so they shouldn't be fully responsible for Bob's distress. In this particular case, my view on it is that this feels like very active engagement by both Eric and Adam. I would definitely lean towards this is discipline worthy based on what I've seen and based on the facts involved here. Ultimately, though, if you've got, and I'm thinking about policy here, right? If your policy doesn't say or tie the use of AI back into your code of conduct, I think you've got a more difficult case to make that. And ultimately, you may have some challenges when the parent says, well, you didn't prohibit the use of AI, the AI did it, right? But if we've got language in our code or in our policy that talks about how student use of AI will be held to the same standards, even if it's not specifically done by the student, I think that makes the application of the code of conduct a little easier. All right. And last hypothetical today, academic integrity. During a remote online exam for his geometry class, Kevin uses an AI tool to generate answers to complex problems. The AI tool provides step-by-step solutions, which Kevin copies directly into his exam submission without understanding the material. When his teacher, Ms. Chen, reviews the results, she notices that Kevin's answers are unusually advanced, giving his past performance. After confronting him, Kevin admits to using AI, but argues that since the exam was unsupervised and there was no explicit rule against AI use, he didn't technically treat. Now, I think we're still probably holding Kevin accountable in this particular case, but the clarity of what is permitted and what's not permitted in that academic setting is, I think, incredibly important. And I know I've said that about 45 times over the course of the last hour. But when we talk about policy and we talk about procedure, those are the kinds of things that I think are important, right? We've got to make sure that we are clear in the areas where we're going to have to apply things in murky areas, but also flexible enough to be able to deal with the different scenarios that are going to come with us. So as we talk about just my general recommendations related to these things, tie things back to your code of conduct. Do the best that you can in order to make sure that what you've got applying is similar to the things that you've done in the past. And ultimately, as it relates to AI policy, the goal is to fill in the gaps that we already have, not to reinvent the wheel. So I've got a couple of takeaways from our hypotheticals. First and foremost, consider how AI is going to fit within our existing constructs, right? How is AI going to be used by our students that are probably smarter than us? And in order to, I don't want to say make mayhem, but challenge us. Next, fill in the weak spots with staff and students, right? So we got to train and educate both our staff and students on those expectations and how to use these tools. Expect the unexpected, because again, students do all kinds of fun stuff, and ultimately tie it back to our existing policy and procedure. And with that, I've finished in 59 minutes, so I'm impressed with my timing on this particular one. Any questions for the good of the order before we wrap our time today?
All right, I'm gonna get my slides back on here just to finish up. I want to thank Adam for the information. You gave us a lot to think about here. And I hope the takeaway from our participants is, making sure that they're looking at their policies, their procedures, and that they have some of those things, reflecting AI, and that as a district, those policies are being updated to make sure that AI is reflected in there. So again, thank you, thank you, thank you. Adam will be sharing slides. Again, slides and recording will be emailed out to you. I want to remind you, one of the actually things that Adam brought up today is the election season and deep fakes and how that's affecting schools. So I want to remind you to save the date. Our next Leader to Leader, October 14th, will be about navigating election season in schools while maintaining positive climate and culture. So again, something that you're probably experiencing in live time in your buildings. We're going to make sure that we talk about that and address. Again, free to members. That'll be October 14th, 9 to 10 o'clock. I see there's a couple things in the chat here. Let me just, a couple thank yous. But again, thank you for spending time with us this morning. We hope that you were able to take away some great tips, recommendations, and considerations. Again, Adam, thank you for being here and providing this information. So with that, I wish everyone a wonderful rest of the day.